Hello everybody, my name is Timothy Brindle. Pleased to be the brother of Believin Stephen Brindle. I just wanted to take a couple minutes and share some of the things that I really appreciate about the Suffering Servant album. I've had a privilege to listen to it over the last few weeks, and it's really been an encouragement to me and my family. First off, what I really notice about this topic of suffering is when Steve is talking about suffering, this is such a concept that we can all relate to. I really want to bring up that suffering is a universal experience that we have as humans. Everyone can relate to suffering. We live in a fallen, broken world where sin has ruined the world and the people in it. As a social worker, my job, as I'm a social worker in North Philly, in a sense kind of makes a living off of the fall. And as the fall has come into the home and into the family and into the marriage and into the relationships, suffering is all around us. It's amongst Christian and non-Christian, black and white, rich and poor. Steve has a really good line on the album where he, in a matter of words, says, "No one is exempt from suffering." I really think that this project is powerful for that reason. We deal with different kinds of suffering: depression, sickness, broken relationships, as I mentioned, tragedies, death of family members. We deal with the consequences of our own sin. Steve does an amazing job of being transparent about that for himself, and I can really relate to the consequences of sin of others and my own sin. Not to mention just a general darkness that this world has because of suffering. Brings me to the second part of the thing that really encourages me about the Suffering Servant album is that suffering is an experience that relates us to God. God, in His goodness, in His mercy and love, has become a human being in the person of Jesus Christ. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And as the name of the album makes clear, one of Christ's names is the Suffering Servant. God became a human, and He can relate to our sufferings. That's amazing. Steve has a song on the album called Christ Can Relate. He really brings that out. Jesus sympathizes with our sufferings. He identifies with us. He comforts us in our sufferings. Christ can help us in the midst of our temptations because He's dealt with the suffering of temptation. But first and foremost, what I love about Steve's project is that it points to the great work of Christ's suffering on the cross, Christ crucified. Jesus graciously bears the wrath of God for us. He suffers in His very soul the judgment that you and I deserve. He takes the curse of God in His very, the very deepest part of who He is on the cross. And probably my favorite part of the album is the interlude where C.J. Mahaney mentions that no matter what kind of suffering you're going through, as a Christian, as a child of God, you can look up and look to Christ and what He has done in His suffering. And none of my sufferings can compare to that. And that comforts me in the midst of my suffering. As I said, the strength of this album is that it points us to our only hope in the midst of suffering, which is not only what Christ has done for us, but Christ's return. Steve makes so clear that Jesus Christ is coming back to banish all suffering, to banish pain, tears, sorrow, the presence of sin, and to bring us into His kingdom forever. I just really encourage anybody who has gone through suffering in a deep, major way, or anybody who hasn't yet, because you will, to check out the Suffering Servant album. I think that one of the misconceptions when it comes to me and Steve as brothers is that because a lot of my projects came out first, that Steve is kind of walking where Tim Brindle has been. And in a sense that may be true, but I just testify that I'm learning from Steve. The way that Steve has opened his heart on this project, he's been so transparent. The way that Steve magnifies the glory of Christ in the midst of our deep struggles, the refuge that Jesus is, the hope that He is when we're going through it. I'm taking notes, and it's inspiring my future work as I'm continuing to pray along with my wife, praying with me, and as we're moving forward, Lord willing, a time of coming back with rhyming. So Even though this project is emotional and melancholy, it's beaming forth with beacons of hope for a fallen, suffering, hurting world. For Christians, a lot of times we're tempted to put on a mask. Steve has actually a song called Take the Mask Off. This album will help us learn how to grieve, help us to learn to be real with our own struggles and our own issues and our own suffering, so that we can bear each other's burdens and bring them to the Lord, who tells us to cast our anxieties upon him. I just really commend the Suffering Servant album to you. I'm proud of my brother, Steve. I love the work he's done and the work that the Lord has done in him. So please check out the Suffering Servant album so that it can be healing to your soul, joy in the midst of trial, and also a time of worship for Christ and his glorious suffering and conquering resurrection. In Jesus' name, peace.